Hello and welcome to another show by us. It's me, Mikey, and my co-host, Dan. Say hello, Dan.
Hello. Hello, Dan.
Hello, Dan.
That's an old joke.
It is. It's a great one. I like it. I like it when you do it.
I do like it too.
And we're going to do a different episode today. We're going to do a Cunning Action, which I don't know what we talked about the last time we did a Cunning Action because we have so many shows right now and
who can say?
I can't even keep track anymore. But this is a show where we kind of talk about D&D design and what we do specifically in campaigns and stuff, really, and kind of give some tips for you folks at home that has nothing to do with monsters, really. So it's the Creature Club formula in a different show, really.
It's sort of the vibes, like it's kind of it's sort of about like how you feel.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. And Dan, what do we decide to talk about today?
We're going to talk some more, and I say some more because it's come up before. We're going to talk some more about dungeons. Now, long-time listeners, and I'm actually going to look up when this happened to make us both feel old. Long-time listeners will remember back in March 2018 when I made a very short episode on dungeons. That was my first foray into solo podcasting because we were just all busy.
Yeah.
And so that is both almost 4 years old as an episode. And of course, it was only featuring me, so we didn't get the perspectives of all of the Creature Club cast. So now we're going to involve Mikey and see what differences he has in terms of his process, and also probably just talk more about it generally. What we do and don't do, how we feel about them in the narrative of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember you uploaded that episode and it was about an hour, and then looking at it now, it's now like 44 minutes, and you quickly did an edit, and then you uploaded it again because it was, you said yourself, you were very sleepy when you recorded, because I think it was like, can anyone record? We need an episode tomorrow. I'll just do it myself. And then you did it And
then I almost fell asleep making it. Because talking to yourself for an hour is not like a conducive way to stay awake.
No, it's and I think you said yourself you actually at one point in recording fell asleep and said nothing.
I think there's actually, I want to say, and obviously there's a funny thing where airtime is longer than real time, right? And so I don't know if it's like 5 minutes or it's actually just like a couple of seconds or whatever, but I definitely just full on fell asleep. and so unfortunately,
that's very good.
Yeah, I mean, I guess unfortunately for the historians among us, but fortunately for everyone else, that episode no longer exists.
Yeah,
because it's been trimmed to a reasonable time.
It's been replaced. That's kind of the original theatrical cut of Dan's Dungeon Tips, and now we have the
the I don't know, revised version.
Yeah.
And like George Lucas, I've destroyed the original and it can't be recovered.
Yeah, you put in a CGI Jabba the Hutt in there, and
and I put in the really bad special effect of Han Solo stepping over his tail.
Yes.
And it's just, wow, it's so distracting. Like
okay, so dungeons, they're in your game most likely if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons. It's half of the game. There's a lot of dungeons in your game, so you want to make sure they're done in a fun and exciting way, because it's a huge part of the game. Of course, you're able to play Dungeons and Dragons without dungeons. You can just do a bit of role-playing and stuff, but it's just a big part of the game, and why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you do a dungeon in Dungeons and Dragons? So a lot of the time, I know in certain games and stuff, like games like Skyrim or like actually just Elder Scrolls games in general, you would go into, like, let's say a dungeon where it's just a dark cave, and then it's just like a few tunnels, and then you fight a few spiders or skeletons, and you get to the end, you get a thing, and you leave. And a lot of people who see video games would see dungeons like that, but I don't want to do that really whenever I'm playing, whenever I'm making one. That's kind of it. Like, I don't know why it's the first thing I'm thinking of really, but I feel like a lot of people would think of a dungeon like that, really. And a lot of my early dungeons were like that, where it's just a tunnel full of a few monsters in it that the players attack. But recently, I remember you actually gave me it must have been on this show of Creature Club, on somewhere you were recommended to me. But of course, people, if this is your first episode, I'll tell you right now, I'm a huge fan of the Legend.
This is your first episode.
if this
Sorry,
is
I know
first
that's not what we're
episode,
talking about.
I don't know. Listen to something else. But yeah, if it happens to be, because you never know sometimes.
You do never know.
I'm a huge fan of the Legend of Zelda franchise, and it's my favorite game series of all time. Yourself, you recommended me a video series on YouTube.
Oh, yes.
By Game Maker's Toolkit. What's your man called from Game Maker's Toolkit? Or does he go by his name? Or I don't know.
I should know his name, but I've actually forgotten it. But yes, I know the series you're talking about.
It's the Boss Keys series. And he does a series on all the 3D Zeldas and their dungeon designs. Really, and I watched that and I love it. And he actually does boss keys for a lot of different games as well, and they're all great videos. And you probably heard of him. If you haven't, I really recommend it. The boss keys series.
Likewise,
but you sent me if you like to do a bit of Zelda dungeon design for your D&D games, this is a good series to watch. And I watched it and I really like it. And I think a lot of dungeon design has spilled from that of course, that YouTube series, but also just Zelda in general. I love making Zelda dungeons because Zelda dungeons are just so kind of fun and iconic. And there's always like a kind of like the puzzle itself is figuring out the dungeon and kind of like finishing the dungeon. And there's always sometimes there's like an overhead kind of like a thing to it. And there's like a figure out this dungeon. And then when you do, you win. And I like that. Yes. I really like that as a dungeon design. I did a very water temple inspired dungeon as one of my first big dungeons, I think, where there was like a middle chamber, which is actually kind of more inspired by the water temple in Twilight Princess, which I think is the same thing, but there's like a middle chamber where they had to get... There's like a middle chamber, and basically if you go into that middle chamber, you go to the boss. And I think I forgot, it was ages ago, but I did this and I forgot what was in there. But basically, when you got there, you beat the dungeon. And they had to go into like 4 corners of the dungeon to find keys of some sort. I forgot, but I think it was just keys. And they had to kind of figure it out. And like, oh, we need 4 keys for this center room. And they always go back to that center room and they figure out that they have to go to that one. And when they got to that center room, they fought a kraken underneath. And it was basically just one of the water temples from Zelda. And if you look at, I kind of top down, if you looked at it top down and drew it out on grid paper, it looked like a 2D Zelda dungeon, you know?
Right, yeah.
I don't know, I actually really like that dungeon. It was a very simple one, but it was just like middle chamber, boss room, but like each room or each path, if you kind of look at it from top down, 1, 2, 3, 4, north, south, east, and west, each path you went, the end of that kind of journey would bring you to a key, and you'd come back and you go to a different compass kind of bit, and you get a key from that, and you go into the middle, and then you go in there. And simple. It's not super like complicated Zelda like big game design kind of mind, but I really liked it as one of my first ones I did. So, and that was actually before you sent me the Boss Keys series.
There you go. Natural instinct,
natural Zelda instinct with that one, and that's just the first one that comes to my head. But Dan, I've been talking for forever now. I just realized. So
that's fine.
Did you have it?
Saying I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that series, and I particularly enjoy the breakdown of like the different kinds of dungeons, because I think in particular in D&D we think of dungeons kind of like narratively, like, so, or maybe narratively is the wrong word, almost like aesthetically, I guess, of like, is the dungeon like an actual dungeon, or is it the stronghold of an enemy, or is it an abandoned mine, or is it like a sunken city where it's a hostile environment with monsters, but it's not a conventional hole in the ground. But the Boss Keys series breaks down this idea of like, well, there's lock and key, which is you are always looking for the key to the door in front of you so that you can continue progressing. There's gauntlets, which are you're just encountering direct problems, often combat encounters, and that's how you resolve them and continue. And then there's puzzle box dungeons, where like the dungeon itself is a big mechanism that the players can manipulate.
Oh yeah,
and utilize to try to like overcome the dungeon. And I think the reason it's really valuable is that it's so easy to especially in fifth edition, and I don't want to make this another episode where we complain about fifth edition, but especially in fifth edition, purely because the combat mechanics are very well explained, and everyone kind of likes having a fight and getting to use all their cool powers.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to be like, well, I'll just make another gauntlet dungeon because that's kind of what people expect. And
yeah,
you know,
and
a room full of zombies and a room full of skeletons.
And you go through the monster manual and you see all these cool monsters, and you're like, I want to use these.
And the art's great, and it's really exciting. Like, that's the reason we started Creature Club. So like,
yeah, exactly. Because we're like, we haven't used these monsters before. Let's talk about them. Like,
yeah, exactly. It's like we can't use them, but we can dream about using them.
Yes.
That's the real, like, you don't buy a monster manual for the monsters you use. You buy it for all the monsters you don't use but dream about using.
Yes, absolutely.
There's always more skeletons.
It's the best coffee table.
People have died everywhere you've been. Like, what's going on?
There's so many skeletons. I was gonna say it's the best coffee table book of the D&D books, where you can just leave it on, like, for guests to come over and like, what's in here? Oh, these are fun monsters. I like these.
Are fun, yeah. Yeah, I'd say the new, probably the best one is that there's that, like, D&D art book. That'd be great.
Ooh, yes, actually.
That'd be a fantastic coffee table book.
Stephen Brady, patron saying the podcast, I lived with him for a bit, and he actually had that as the coffee table book, and it's great. It's a great book.
It's a great choice.
I think it was the same one. I think it's the same one we're thinking about, but it's the big, pretty much D&D coffee table.
The enormous one, yeah. But anyway, so I think in particular the reason I would recommend that series, especially the early episodes, when he kind of breaks down how he codifies dungeons and how he does it and why he does it, I think that process, because like what he's doing is he's trying to come up with a metric to measure dungeons, almost in the context of like, is this an interesting design? You know, good and bad design is maybe like too subjective, but like, is this design interesting for the player, or is it maybe kind of boring? Like it funnels you in one direction and it's not very engaging.
Yeah.
And the process of him finalizing that system is almost something that we can use and unpack, work backwards, and use it to build dungeons that have more than one, kind of basically don't obey the kind of traditional paradigm of like, oh, well, there's a monster in your way. And I think I think for me anyway, I'm not sure about you, Mikey, but the problem I always have when I think about lock and key dungeons is I worry, in particular in the context of puzzles, I worry that either they'll get solved too quickly or they'll take too long.
Yes, I know. I do. I actually very much worry about that. Luckily enough, all the riddles and puzzles I've ever brought out have actually been kind of easy enough to figure out, really. Where I'm happy for an easy like puzzle or riddle. I'm actually I don't want it to take too long. I'm happy if they're like, oh, it's the answer's time, and then like I like that because it kind of gives the player, like, the player can be kind of clever, and then like if they figure it out instantly, that's fine. I'm actually okay with that. But for too long, I think that's the biggest, like, I have both of us have been in games where the riddle would take up the entire game, you know.
I've had games where like I've almost had games where, and I'm sure you've had them as well, where there like isn't a riddle, and the players are like, the solution must be here somewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think it's an interesting kind of conundrum. I think, as you say, the solution is probably just to have something that's too easy, and something else, a principle I don't know if it's come up somewhere else or if it probably has, but a principle that I've kind of adopted in my last campaign, because that had deliberately I incorporated a much more puzzles, and I had all these mini dungeons, almost like the shrines in Breath of the Wild, deliberately very short dungeons that you could finish in kind of a game or maybe two. And all of them tried to incorporate some kind of puzzle, because I was like, I never use puzzles in dungeons. I should do a puzzle for once and actually try something. The kind of like paradigm I adopted was sort of saying, okay, well, this is this is the problem, and this is how I want the players to think about it. So it was never that I would say like, okay, well, this is my solution, but any solution that demonstrates they understand the principles of the puzzle, like, is basically also a pass, was what I decided.
Yeah.
And obviously that's kind of a bit abstract, but as an example, I think one of the things I did was I had a situation where there was a a locked door, and it was in the Dungeon of Illusions, and the key didn't exist physically, and effectively all I wanted really was the players to manifest an illusion of the key. So they could do that by casting spells, but there were also deliberately drawings of, and this is the solution they actually used, there were like engravings of keys into the different parts of the rooms, and by using a mirror they basically reflected a key into the lock. And again, it was a case of like, I decided that like, well, you're supposed to think about the context of like, this is the Dungeon of Illusion, so maybe there is no key, so I need to like lose one, I need to fake one. And that was my argument was like, yep, that's what I wanted you to do. I want you to understand the context and to come up with a solution that makes sense for you, that I am also like, yes, that makes sense.
Yes.
And I think that also helps with that problem, is not having a strict definition of a solution, but more having a heuristic definition about what you think the player, like what you kind of expect or maybe want the players to do.
Yes. For something like that, I think it's good to have a few answers in the pocket. Yes. Kind of like just where if you only have one answer for like a riddle like that, then they'll be stuck finding it. And it like you would think yourself it might be easy, but it's just like they might not be on the same wavelength, and they might not even like know where you're coming from and the context and stuff. So you'll be there forever. So just having a few ways out of it is a good way to go, I think, just in case.
Yes.
I'm just remembering actually of a puzzle I had where it was another kind of simple one, where it was very much like Indiana Jones' Last Crusade puzzle. Do you remember the one where he's spelling out, is he spelling out Jesus?
Yeah.
Yahweh
Yahweh is the it's the Hebrew term for God.
That's right. Yes.
It's God's name, basically.
Yes. So they're jumping the letters what I did really was throughout the dungeon I would have on the wall a bit of like lore about something, about like a battle or something, or a hero who the dungeon was for, and then throughout the entire thing, and it came to kind of like a grid of symbols. And let's say, I've forgotten exactly what the story was, but let's say it was like it began in a big fire, and there's like a symbol of fire and on it. So you jump on the fire first, and then like the hero attacked with a big spear, and then you see a spear there, something like that. And then they're kind of like, I like that because it's kind of like, I think I remember them kind of walking through it and going like, hold on, that's the story. Or I might have actually kind of gone like, all right, here you go. Here's the story. And then oh, maybe it was in the same room or something, as it was like, that must be something to do with the story. So we're going to kind of follow it. And then they figure it out, and it's fun. That's kind of cool. And also, I like dungeons kind of being a kind of telling a bit of lore about your game or your campaign stuff through the dungeon, or like kind of telling a story of why the dungeon's there in the first place is a good one, instead of just having like why is the fire temple in Zelda? Why is that there? I don't know. Like, it just is. So kind of coming up with ideas to like explain.
Why is there a dungeon in the well? It's just there.
It's just there.
It doesn't matter. Has it always been there? Who knows? Okay, get in.
Just get in. Hop in the well. It's great. It's fun.
I before we move on from puzzles, the last thing I was going to say was I have become somewhat infamous for that same playgroup of the campaign I'm running, because in one case they were presented with a puzzle, and because it was a riddle and I didn't want the players to take too long, I just had a failsafe that if they didn't pass the riddle, they instead just got another combat encounter, and it was a combat encounter against a big octopus, just because I just thought it would be interesting.
There's a lot of big octopuses in your game, actually.
I just think they're great.
Yeah, remember that one that popped up and then we just didn't fight?
And then didn't, so I will also say that is that a good failsafe is consider having a puzzle where the punishment is effectively, okay, well, you have to have another fight.
Yes.
Because even though it doesn't always, necessarily feel like it, the context of forcing your players to use more resources does allow additional combats to become additional problems for them to solve.
Yeah, and they can't long rest in there, so they're like losing health. They're using whatever they have. So yeah, that's a great way of doing it. That's also actually, now thinking of, very Zelda as well, where let's say if you're doing a puzzle and you do it wrong, it goes like and then a skeleton drops from the ceiling and fights you or something like it. So like I like that. That's really cool. That's a very good way of kind of like, oh, we keep like losing this puzzle, so we have to do another encounter. Okay, then now it's time for me to actually think and how to do this. We can't just brute force it. So because there's infinite skeletons or something, whatever it is. Okay, so for this episode, I was thinking, how about we kind of start really from the start of a dungeon design, really, and kind of move from there. The dungeon. There is a dungeon that the players need to go to.
Okay.
What is this dungeon? Why is this dungeon here? What kind of dungeons can we do for folks at home to use?
For folks at home to use, in that case, I want to make it something that's not too mad or complicated. How about we keep it simple, and that the dungeon in this case is a prison that has fallen out of use. It's a ways outside of town. It's dug into the ground. It's effectively a big pit, like an enormous oubliette.
Yeah.
And in a crueler time in the past, a mighty empire that ruled this land threw its worst down this hole effectively and forgot about them.
Yeah.
And this was how they dealt with their criminals. And while it is, for the most part now, not in use, it is still used as a hiding place for bandits and creatures of the night. And we might also say that for those seeking lore regarding that fallen empire, even its prisons might hold some clues that would help a stalwart adventurer uncover valuable treasure.
Plenty of writing desks in there with stuff on top, possibly if they haven't been taken already. But that's one thing with when you said bandits. That's another thing I like, because the Sunless Citadel, which we've talked about a few times on this show, I really like that campaign.
I love a good Sunless Citadel.
And like many dungeons, and I think a few people actually say this, that it's very fun to have kind of like almost factions inside the dungeon. So in Sunless Citadel, you have the kobolds and goblins and the druid guy. And spoilers, I guess. Maybe I don't think it's spoilers. You're looking for him or something, but he's there too. So there's kind of there's a few different, but there's basically like you have one part where it's kobolds run the place, and the other part it's like goblins, hobgoblins, orcs. I forgot. It's one of those kind of.
I think there's just goblins and just kobolds. And actually no, I was about to say
there's a bugbear at one point, I think.
Oh, you might be. I think there's a bugbear, and is there a dragon in charge of the kobolds, or am I remembering?
No,
fourth edition dungeon. Yeah, I'm running a 4th edition dungeon. Never mind.
The dragon is like mates with the kobolds, and the goblins took it, and then you had to save it or something. It's just like a young dragon, I think. It's like a super young dragon. So
right.
It's kind of like
gotcha.
But it's still kind of powerful. But it's not actually running it. It's kind of like in cahoots with it. Yeah. Anyway, the factions are fun inside a dungeon if you want to go that route. So if you just want to have dungeon full of skeletons, whatever, that's fine. But having like almost like a kind of a civilization in there, or kind of a little warring faction in there of like, oh, there's kobolds in this side kind of hiding out in there. Because if you're going with your prison idea of your sunken prison, and some bandits are in there, maybe one bandit group are in there, and then they're like, don't go deeper, because the undead souls of like the prisoners who used to be thrown in here are in the deeper side of it, and they keep coming out, and we have to fight them back, but they keep coming back, kind of stuff, maybe something like that. Or there's slime coming out of the walls.
When you said you can have factions or you can have skeletons, I did immediately think how much fun it would be if you had faction skeletons, like a bunch of undead, but they can't stand each other. Like, like none of them can die, so they just fight and then come back. But they're just like miserable, and they all hate each other. Like they all moan and stuff like that. It's like an abandoned castle, and it's like two families that couldn't get on with each other in life, and they still don't get on with each other in death. Like
both family are skeletons, yeah.
Oh yeah, like entirely skeletons, like okay. But like just skeletons that like still retain their personality because they, I don't know. You could just say like, oh, they died like bickering so much that their souls couldn't leave their bodies.
Yeah.
So they're just like the same, like pompous arseholes, but they're skeletons, and they just hate
But they're
each other so
skeletons.
much.
That's fun. I like that. That's and I kind of the reason why I start with that question is I like to kind of when I'm making a dungeon is like, why is this here? Why like there's a like why is a dungeon here? Why
Yeah.
the heroes go into this dungeon? Maybe there's treasure. That's great. Treasure is just always a good thing to have. Or maybe like my the baker's daughter is gone and they're in there, or the baker's family's in there, or whatever, or like the high lord is like, people keep being taken to this prison, something's going on there's some money, but whatever. That's a way of doing it. You can do plenty of ways with that. So that's that one. So the second question I would say is, what kind of encounters would you put in this dungeon then? What kind of fights, what kind of like monsters would be in the dungeon? What's your thought process on it?
So I think, and this I think this did come up in the previous previous episode, I guess we can call it. I don't know if episode feels wrong. Like, it's like
That was like 2018. How long was that? God, I don't want to think about it.
That was 100 years ago, I think.
Today I thought it was 2023. I had to look up on Google what year is it, because I actually thought it was 2023.
I did have a moment where I said, "Oh yeah, I mean, hopefully it'll all be different in 2023." And they were like, "What?" And I was like,
Is this what happens when you pass like your mid-20s? Is that you kind
could
of
be,
just
yeah.
it becomes a blur?
it's just who cares? It could be anything.
Yeah,
anything
yeah.
can happen. So this has come up in the previous episode, but my process is probably still fundamentally quite similar, in that. So I'm not a great artist, or a great draftsman might be the correct term, or cartographer for someone who draws dungeons. I'm not good at any of that. And I'm also very lazy. So I don't, like, for example, if I have a room in a dungeon and I don't plan on the players fighting in there, I just won't draw it. I won't do it. Instead, I'll basically use a really simple diagram of I will for each room I will make a box, and then I will draw lines connecting those boxes to represent the connections between those rooms, and I will write above and below the lines to represent the kinds of connections they are and any details about them. So that's kind of my fundamental process. Once I've nailed down, like for example in this case I've nailed down, okay, it's a sunken prison, it's outside town, it was used by a former empire, it's probably full of like, off the top of my head I'd say like, okay, it's got undead prisoners, it's got maybe like a powerful specter haunting it because of all the suffering that went on in there. It's probably got some bandits or like some subterranean monsters who maybe like carrion monsters like the carrion crawler, or other things like that feed, or even like ghouls, like things that feed off the dead. So I'm like, okay, that all makes sense. So then I would start with like, okay, the entrance in this case is just the ground, right? Because it's a hole in the ground. So like, I'd probably think about like, how big is the hole? Like, do you jump into it? Do you have to climb down? Is it like filled in, or like how do you get in? Like, does it let sunlight in? And then my simple process would be box for each room I want the players to go in, line for each connection between the rooms, and I would figure out only later, for example, where there might be fights and where I might actually want to have planned kind of encounters. But then, like you, I would think, okay, I think almost I wouldn't think, and maybe this is something that I can work on. I wouldn't necessarily think in terms of like what factions are in the dungeon. I think I'd almost think like what, like I think it's like Matt Colville, who said it's your job as a dungeon master to come up with problems, not solutions. And I think that's kind of what I do when I come up with a dungeon. I go, what problems are in this dungeon? In other words, like what's all the different issues that the players will have while they're trying to make their way through. So obviously there's monsters, but I'm like, oh well, it's a prison, so it's probably got like a lot of locked doors, and it's got a need for like special keys for different doors. There might be more secure areas, or areas that are deliberately designed to like restrict your movements, because obviously if you're a prisoner they want to keep you in certain places, and those would be a great place for like a monster to ambush you, like say a very narrow corridor so that prisoners couldn't all escape at once. That would be a great place for a monster to ambush the party, because obviously they are restricted. which would be a problem. And also in the context of a game, or in the context of, again, the narrative, the aesthetic, it makes sense that a prison would have a thing like that, because I think one of my probably biggest problem when it comes to designing dungeons is effectively, why would they have that? So whenever there's in the context of the game I'm running, right, like there was all these puzzle chambers, and they were kind of like the shrines in Breath of the Wild, so they were allowed to be very gamey dungeons where it's like, this is a riddle that you are expected to solve because you're being put through a trial, and like that is a very deliberate thing. Like the people in the universe of the game are building a trial for you to solve, so there's a puzzle, but outside of that kind of context, it's often like, well, why would it be a riddle, or why would it be a weird thing? Like, why wouldn't it just be like a key, or just something that you just do? Like, people aren't like, we're not at, like, it's like, if you work here, you don't want it to be a pain in the ass to get around, like, like,
but
if
it's a trial, like, it's
yes, exactly, yeah,
it's a trial. So you like the specific challenge that the dungeon is giving you, it expects you to do it that way, like, it expects you to finish it, except for like, why do we need all these weird keys and riddles to get through like this shopping center? Like, just because I need to go like buy some bread. Why do I need to solve a riddle to buy bread? Like,
the Resident Evil 2 police station comes to mind, with like all the weird like emblem locks and stuff like that. You're like, this people work here, presumably, like, like. It's only because everyone's already dead when you show up that you don't get to ask anyone, like, why is it like this?
I guess in the Resident Evil universe, it's just the world is based on keys and stuff like that. That is also true. Like, the universe of Resident Evil is not our universe for lots of reasons, but one of them is just people love emblems. So I think that's my problem, is that, like, I think I don't embrace... I'm kind of almost so critical of the notion that, like, a place you're in should make sense for what it was and what it should be. And that affects two things mostly for me. First of all is obviously, like, let's say we're taking this example, the sunken prison. I wouldn't put like a riddle door in the sunken prison, because I'd be like, well, any prisoner with a tongue can solve a riddle door. So that's stupid. It should be like a key, or just you yell at someone to open the door. Like, so like that in my head, I wouldn't want to do that. If I had a riddle door, I would have to come up with a justification for why it exists. But maybe there's a special key somewhere in the dungeon for maybe like a guards only area.
Yes, exactly.
That's like, oh, we need these special keys to get in here because we don't want the prisoners getting them. Or there's like a password maybe to get in there. To like, speak whatever words, and you can go into this kind of guard area, or just maybe the key makes more sense though. You go in there, maybe even if it's just like a treasure room of some sort. It's like, oh, it's the evidence room, or it's the place where we put all the prisoners stuff. Like, you just throw it in there. And like stuff like that kind of makes more sense, because like, oh, we need to lock it somehow, and in a fantasy way, special keys or riddles make sense in D&D, instead of like, eye retinal scans and stuff, whatever.
Yeah, like, exactly. Yeah, and it's like, and I think the other thing I was going to say is size, because obviously, and I think probably another part of this might be to do with, like, effectively the difference between where we are and where we live, as opposed to where D&D started, which is like, the maps in D&D are like the basic measurement of the basic unit of measurement in a D&D combat map is a 5-foot square, which is like 1.5 meters. Which is like,
that's weird.
It's like that's quite a lot of room, it's actually, like, I'm like 6'5", so like I could almost fit. In fact, if I lay diagonally, I could fit inside one of those hexes. So like, that means like, when you draw like a room, it's like a 4x4 room. It's like, that's a pretty big room, like a 20-foot by 20-foot room. It's not enormous, but it's not nothing. And that's the other thing, is whenever it's like, okay, I'm just designing some spaces people live in, it's always like, well, I mean, like, unless these people are really rich, then, and let's say in this context, right, it's a sunken prison. Okay, well, they had to dig everything out of the ground. So wouldn't everything be as small as possible? Because then they would have to do less digging. And even if that means everything's like 2 squares wide, like that wouldn't matter because the people there aren't living in a D&D combat grid most of the time. So it's fine because like actually like 1.5 meters is a pretty good amount of clearance for like 2 people to get past each other. It's just not in D&D combat. It is all the rest of the time. So I don't know. Yeah, that's the other thing is I'm always like, it's always like space. Like everything has to be enormous in D&D.
Because you kind of draw it out on the map and you're like, is that big enough? Because you see a person, you put a unit down on 1 square and you're like, that's, you kind of compare that to yourself. Like, oh, I'm standing here. That's where I am. And then next to that, is like having your mate next to you.
Yeah, exactly.
But when you think about, it's 5 feet, then like you got to start thinking that, and you can make it a lot smaller and stuff. Really, I remember drawing out a lot of stuff for D&D, and I looked up a YouTube video of like, I think, I was drawing like maps for like areas, and I was like, how far is a kilometer?
Oh yeah.
And then I looked up a video of a guy, and he just walked a kilometer. He just kind of like, he's like, here's how, not a kilometer, maybe. And actually, that's pretty far. It was kind of like, how far is like a meter or something, or like a certain amount of meters. And he just walked it. And he's like, that's pretty far. That's like,
yeah.
But it wasn't a kilometer. That's very far.
Was it like in the context of like movement in D&D, like how long is 120 feet or something?
Yes. Yeah. It was definitely a D&D kind of measurement, I think. So
yeah.
And they're great. Those videos are good. So it just kind of like shows you and like it kind of gives you a context really of how you draw it out.
Yes.
Just a quick thing on the prison. When I did my prison game, Hazard's Rock, which was just a rock in the ocean, and then inside the rock was the prison.
Yes.
I had an area where there was a monster. I think I did like a giant, like a really large basilisk, basically, and it was kind of like a Harry Potter basilisk, where it's a big snake, and it was basically in a pit where the guards would throw prisoners if they want them gone, and it was like, I think, like a pit of a monster in a prison's fun. Just like, all right, here's a pit, a monster's in there, or a few monsters are in there. It's like, we want to get rid of you, so we'll throw you in with these monsters, and that's good, But it wasn't like a small little like pit. It was like an entire kind of level almost, where they had to run around and trying to find a way out. But that's more video gamey. But you can kind of do it any way you want, really. But I like that. If you're gonna do the sunken prison, consider a monster pit. It's always a bit of fun. Okay,
I like that.
So
that's very good.
We have wides there. We have the kind of stuff that's going on. We have a bunch of things there. I'm just kind of like thinking of questions of like for our folks at home to like ask themselves when they're making their own dungeon, like kind of like prompts for them, really. That's kind of what I'm thinking here.
We could always go through the 5-step dungeon, and we could just go through each step. So the 5-room dungeon is a paradigm invented by someone. Hang on, I'm going to just get up an actual article on it instead of just making it up.
Yeah.
But basically, a 5-room dungeon is. It's a sort of a metaphor, or not metaphor is the wrong word. It's like sort of a hypothetical dungeon that's like, here's 5 rooms that encapsulate every kind of like different challenge you should have in a roleplay game, basically. Not just like D&D. It can be used in anything. 5-room dungeon is it's a suggestion effectively for mapping out a quick dungeon crawl, or even just for deciding all the different kinds of things a dungeon can have. So 5-room dungeon has 5 rooms. Look at that. It has the entrance, the puzzle, the setback, the boss fight, and the reward. So the entrance is the entrance to the dungeon, and it often contains what the paradigm just kind of calls a guardian, and that can obviously be like a monster, or just like a puzzle, or a complication, or just any kind of blockage that makes it impossible to just get into the dungeon, basically.
Yes. Speak friend and enter kind of stuff,
Exactly, yeah. That's a great example. It's kind of like, it's the entrance and its guardian is sort of meant to answer the question of like, where's the dungeon placed, and then kind of also why haven't other people gone into the dungeon already?
Yes.
And so obviously you don't always have to answer that, but the intention is that those two kind of keep that in mind. So the second one is the puzzle. So the puzzle is a puzzle or role-playing challenge. It's basically something to challenge the non-combat part of your character's character sheets. So obviously, a lot of the time that is an actual puzzle, but it can also just be like a character asks them some hard questions, like the spirit of someone long dead interrogates their beliefs and then vanishes. Like, it doesn't actually have to be like you win. It just has to be something that's like, you can't win this like with a spell or a sword. You have to just talk or think.
Yes.
Then there's the setback. The setback is just anything that impedes the forward progress. It's like a room that has a false exit, or it has a trapdoor, or it has something that slows down the party, makes
maybe
it harder.
like the walls kind of crushing in, like Star Wars, something like that.
Or you were almost a Jill sandwich.
Yes,
is a good example of a setback. Then finally, there's the boss fight, which you've touched on already. Who's in charge of this dungeon, and when do I get to kick their ass? And then finally, the last one is the reward, which which again, this is sort of abstract, but it can either be like loot, physical loot, or it can be like the answers to the problem. Like, if it was a narrative adventure, it's like, we've confronted the villain and thwarted their plans, and we've learned why they were doing all this, and that's kind of the reward.
As you said, it could be loot, where some guy out in the open were like, oh, go into the ancient temple where an ancient hero had a special sword, and they were in here. And then maybe the boss is the ancient hero itself, a specter form, or like, fight me and test your metal. And then you fight it, and like, all right, you won. And then there's swords there in the next room, like, oh, I get to use this now. Kind of, that's a very simple version of that, that you could do. So, but as you were saying there, it could be almost anything. It could be knowledge. It could be knowledge. It could be it could be like a bit of information that you're looking for in the game.
It could be a person you're looking for, like a hostage or a prisoner or someone you care about.
Or it could be just loot, and that's fun too. But like, as long as it's a special campaign specific loot, that's what you need for that. I guess when I was asking who's the boss, like, what kind of boss would you like to use in a dungeon? Like, what kind of bosses do you like to use, really? Kind of, it can be general, or you can have a specific answer, like, what do you like doing?
It depends on the dungeon, and it depends on what I want from the dungeon, why the players are going there. Generally speaking, I like to pick a monster of any kind. I suppose the only maybe rule off the top of my head would be like, I don't pick human enemies. I don't necessarily pick like NPCs to be at the end of dungeons. It's like I like monsters to be there. Like, it's almost like, outside the dungeon, everywhere else is where there are people and you might have to fight them. But in dungeons, there are monsters, and that's your problem now. So I think that would be the only kind of, if I had any principles, he said, not for the first time. If I had any principles, that might be one of them. But it would be very contextual. I think a lot of the time, I would almost say a lot of the time, who's in charge of the dungeon comes very late in the process for me.
I think, actually, because I like boss fights myself. I kind of like them, so I kind of tend to kind of go backwards, I think, really. I like, most of the time, not all the time, but like most of the time, I think, where I kind of pick an enemy, I pick a monster. And even if it's like if an NPC enemy, it's like a superpowered NPC enemy. But I think I'd use monsters as well, I'd say, most of the time. But I would kind of go from that, like, I want to fight this thing for this dungeon. Because as my example earlier on at the start of the podcast, I wanted to do a Kraken fight for some folks. Yeah. So I was like, how can I do a Kraken? I could do a water temple for a Kraken because it's a water monster. Let's do a water temple. I kind of work backwards from there. I tend to like kind of go and like, all right, so Kraken, I need a dungeon for it because you need a dungeon before you fight a boss. That's my Zelda upbringing there. And then like, how do I do it from there? So I like to pick the boss and then go backwards. So I'm kind of the opposite of you, Dan, most of the time anyway. Like, so, because I love boss fights. I really like. I just like bosses. Encounters are Bosses are very good. Encounters are okay in D&D, but like especially in 5th edition. But I
Got him.
got him. I know. My video game mind speaking to me when I say I like bosses a lot. So I go bosses down instead of like up to bosses as Daniel.
You start at the bottom, and then you're here. You're right.
Then you're here. Yeah, start at the bottom, then we're here. Okay, so yeah. So what would you think would be a cool boss for the sunken prison that we're thinking of?
So I first of all, there's the suggestion you made of like literally like a big monster that they used to feed prisoners to.
Yes.
As soon as you described a big snake, have you played Metroid Fusion?
I have not played Metroid Fusion.
Okay. Minor spoilers for Metroid Fusion.
Minor spoilers.
Which is
Watch out, folks.
Which is I think might be a 19-year-old game at this stage.
Yeah.
There's a great moment where you are going through. So Metroid Fusion is basically like it's set on a kind of space station that's meant to be like a research, basically like a research habitat for lots of different interesting alien monsters and alien creatures. And there's basically a bad parasite going through and doing damage and stuff, and you're worried about it, and you're dealing with it because you're Metroid and that's your job. And there's a really great bit where I think it's like Sector 3, and you go through all of Sector 3, and you keep being warned about a monster in Sector 3 that's like this enormous serpent. And one of the first things you learn when you get to Sector 3 is like that monster has broken containment, and it is one of the most dangerous entities on this space station, so you need to be really careful. And you keep finding signs of its destruction as you pass through, and finally you get to its chamber, and it's dead. It's been skeletonized. The parasite has already killed it, and now you have to fight the parasite.
Ooh, I like that. Yeah,
it's so cool. Like you literally just come into a room, and there's just a big skeleton in a tank because it's already dead. And I just immediately think like that'd be so like interesting if the whole setup for the dungeon was like, you know, everyone knows the sunken prison, everyone knows of the serpent of the sunken prison and how dangerous it is, how it swallowed men whole, and it had an infinite appetite, and it like, you know, it was so full of sinners that it itself like grew to loathe all men, and it's like got all these horrible myths around it, and then you arrive and it's dead and something worse has taken its place.
That is really cool. I like that. Just kind of like what could do this, and maybe you can also have like holes kind of coming out of the pit, basically. So it's like, oh, it got out.
Yeah, at
so
some
it's
stage
out,
it got out. Yeah.
Yes, and maybe that could kind of lead to why it's like kind of sunken, and why it might not be the one reason why it's kind of to its downfall, but it can be add to the chaos of whatever happened or whatever you want to do. But that's really cool. Kind of like it's an easy way to build up your big bad or whatever you want to put in there, of like just like even a bigger monster or just like a whatever you want to do. Just I really like that. It's a fun idea. That's kind of like it just kind of messes with your expectations a bit, because of course your players would go through it and think, oh, we're gonna fight this serpent. It's down here somewhere, isn't it?
There's a big snake, and everyone. All we've learned about is the big snake. So
yes, like of course the big snake's gonna show up. Like
you utter buffoons.
Yes.
So in terms of then what you'd actually fight, because I don't want to leave our listeners hanging, I actually think that if you want to workshop that idea, you could basically say that the serpent eventually did swallow so many evil men that literally it birthed like this like horrible grave amalgam that's just like dozens of skeletons like bound together, like all chained and wrapped and like wailing, and it's just
that's high concept there, Dan. I like it.
And it's just this like enormous horrible, like, you know, you could almost just call it like it's regret. You know, it's like the monster's name is regret, and that's all it is, because it's just all these men who like for whatever reason ended up in this prison and were swallowed by this great beast, and all they have left is regret. And it's just you know, it's got these big chains. It's got moves where it like, you know, it like sort of seizes you in place. Great chains come out of the earth and pull down, and they pull you down. Maybe like little serpents start to eat away at you. Maybe you just feel like ennui. You've got no strength, no spirit. You can't fight anymore. There's no point, and that's how it fights you. It sort of attacks your mind, and it horrifies you.
Yes.
And then the paladin hits it really hard once, and the fight's over.
And the fight's over. Okay, I hit it with my greatsword attack. I got 19, so that's actually a crit.
Yeah. Oh, that's a crit. Yeah, of course, yeah.
That's a crit, and then I double attack. I hit that. I'm gonna do action surge with that one. Sure. Oh, another crit. Great.
Okay, sure.
It's dead. Okay, you killed it in the second go, so it's fine. But I really like that, and also that's kind of like you're not just like coming out with a new monster. You kind of foreshadowed it in a way, because it's like, oh yeah, you were explaining how there was these evil men all throughout this prison, and they're technically the enemy of it. They're like, all of them together are like the boss that you're fighting, and it's very weirdly high concept. I like it. I like stuff like that, of just like because it's kind of in our world down. In our kind of shared world we do for D&D, Scaros, belief is a big power system. Most of the power in it is belief. So something like this could actually make a lot of sense, where like a monster can be built from like an idea of so strong, of like evil so strong and so concentrated, can make a monster like this. I can see that happening in Scaros, no problem.
Absolutely. And if you are interested in running your dungeon like this, something that would be really kind of fun, that would be a nice setup for your attentive players, if they ask, there are never any skeletons in the prison. There's no remains.
Good. Yeah. Yes.
Even though there should be.
But you can't do the skeleton family.
No,
that's
you can. They are mutually exclusive.
Yes.
In that, the last boss is Skeleton Divorce Court. Which is way higher concept.
It's just Phoenix Wright. You do a Phoenix Wright court case at the end.
You just make them play Phoenix Wright.
But it's divorce instead of murder.
Instead of murder, yeah. Or it is murder. Actually, that would be pretty cool. If the final boss was just solve the actual murder that took place centuries ago. Like,
that's fun. I like that too. But yeah,
even higher concept.
Yes.
But yeah, that would be something I would say. I would say, like, there, if any of your players ask, that there are no remains in the prison. There's no bodies strewn about, even though all stories say there should be. There are still living monsters, and maybe even those bandits we mentioned at the top layer. But like, there are no remains anywhere. And maybe if you're concerned your players wouldn't notice that, you could have the bandits complain about it, that they were looking to grave rob and they couldn't find anybody.
Yeah, and maybe even the bandits were like, we go down there and we don't come back, or they drag us down there or something, or it's like monsters seem to, whenever we die, then we can't find our remains of our friends anymore.
Oh yeah.
So they just add to it,
Yeah, or even like, if you want to make them more opportunistic and evil, it's like, oh yeah, it's just, we just toss them down there. Like,
yeah,
like, it's like, oh, it's easier for us than digging them a grave, just chuck them down the hole.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you did want to have kind of a follow through, you could say that one of those bandits who died found something that, like, let's say the party again, right? They're looking for lore on this old empire. Say that one of the bandits found an old trinket or something, and the players might suspect it's valuable. But he died, and we tossed him in the hole after taking his boots, because we're bandits. We don't care about some weird trinket that won't sell for anything. It's like,
yeah, I thought I saw things shining like that on some guy. I threw him down the hole though.
Yeah, he had some weird keepsake around his neck, and it wasn't worth anything because it was made of brass, so we didn't want to keep it.
Yeah,
so we tossed him in the hole with it.
A D&D party is just the bandits.
Yeah, literally, it's just like they're
PCs.
They're just you, but they don't have the benefit of being the main characters.
Yeah. That's cool. That's a fun dungeon there. I like that. That's very interesting. That's like, and okay, so we did that there. How can we use that as, like, what message can we give to our folks at home for, like, making dungeons, as using that kind of like as a case study, really, of what we just kind of brainstormed there? What can we tell the folks at home? That's a very
interesting question. I think what I would say is that there are a lot of different methodologies to designing a dungeon. You can either do what Mikey does, and you can sort of start with a boss and almost build the dungeon on top of the boss. So sort of like, well, there's definitely whatever happens at the end of this dungeon is a big boss in a room, and
yes,
I'm going to build outward from that room. I tend to do the opposite. I tend to start from like, okay, well, the players are in the world, right? They're in the overworld, I guess we could call it. The normal world, the mundane world. And they find the entrance to the dungeon. And that's where I tend to start. And then I will kind of map out the dungeon inward, going inside from the entrance. And I'll try to describe how the rooms connect and how they might be different problems.
Yes.
Sorry, go on.
I'm very similar with that as well. Actually, I kind of would go from the entrance outwards, and then just like I just know what's at the end.
I get you.
You know?
As in, so you do start from the entrance as well, but you're like, I know at the end of this room is a boss. Like, it's
yes, conceptually, I'd be like, they're fighting a kraken at the end. They're fighting that. And
yeah, I get you. Yeah, you've got a clear end goal.
Yes.
So, and then I would say, other than that, there's the context of narrative and aesthetics. And that is, I think, a very personal thing. I wish I had any kind of useful advice on that. I would say, given that you're the one putting it out of the dungeon, it should be something you like, because it's a lot of work. Running D&D generally is a lot of work, and building dungeons is a lot of work. So I would say, whenever you are building a dungeon, like, just try to make it something that you'll enjoy thinking about, because otherwise it will be even more work.
I will give it like just from my own experience really is that I've always liked using dungeons as a way to share your world a little bit more. So you can have, just artwork on the walls, or like carvings on the walls, or even just like, poems. I don't think I've ever written a poem for a game, but something like that. Stories. You can add your world into the dungeon. It's a way of telling a side of your like the world that you make as a DM, and kind of putting it in there, because you don't like, I feel like you shouldn't waste it too much. There's like even if it's a small bit, every dungeon has a little story to tell about your world.
I think that's a really good point, Mikey. Yeah, I think that's brilliant, because like even in the context of say the sunken prison that we've been talking about, we said this empire put evil men in there, but like maybe that's the empire's point of view. Maybe somewhere in that dungeon you can recover evidence of like a rebel leader, right, who was tossed in there because he was too much trouble. And maybe there's more to the old empire than you thought. There was complexity even in those times, and there were people who opposed that rule. And maybe through them you can uncover more about the world, and find more adventure, almost. Like if you learn like, well, there actually used to be like this ancient like resistance movement, and they had their leader was in this prison. Like I wonder where they were. I wonder what happened to them all. Like I wonder, because they're not kept. They're not part of the grand narrative that the empire wrote, but they did exist. So I wonder what else we can learn about them. And they might have known things about the empire that we don't know, because they saw a different side of it.
And that adds like so much to the narrative, like of the boss, like the build up of regret. Because if it is just a rebel leader, then they're just like these, whatever, from their point of view, evil people run this empire, threw us all into this prison, and we all hate them for it, and we hate everything for it, and now we're like this big monster now, basically. So it just kind of adds it's cool. It's really cool. It's a big kind of like you can. I really think that you shouldn't waste a dungeon, because I think you can add a teeny bit of a little story in there, no matter what. Like even if it's just like the tomb of an old hero, you can tell a little bit of their story with it, and I think the players would love that. I think players generally tend to like that a bit, even if it's a small bit of story. I remember our friend Rob DM'd dropping the sword, and I was in the game for a bit, and his dungeon, his kind of underwater dungeon he did, which is basically like a Dark Souls level, really, and it was like a very much environmental storytelling kind of thing, and I loved it. It was fantastic. Kind of stuff where like people sitting in chairs, like still sitting in their chairs underneath the water. It was so Dark Souls, but it was so cool. I like that. Dungeons work so well for that. Like,
yes,
and that's my advice, really. I'd say I would give to the folks at home, really.
That's a great, I like that. That's good.
Any final words on dungeons? I think we reached the hour, and I think we're at a good time there.
I think my final words would be, just do what DMs should always do and just steal. Like, just steal things. Like, if you're not sure about what to do for a dungeon, like, go look up Sunless Citadel and maybe steal it. Maybe use it wholesale. Maybe your players won't recognize it. You know, swap out the kobolds for werewolves and the goblins for flumps, and it's a new dungeon. You know, like, so I would say, and I just think, just steal constantly. Look at everything else, use it.
And like, it's a great way to start. And there's loads of resources for like random dungeon generators as well out there, where you just click and then it makes you a dungeon, and it says in here is these monsters and in here is these monsters, and even if you don't use them, you can start from there, and like you can kind of build from there. And also, as you said, Dan, steal, you can just like, oh, you found the Sunless Citadel map, you can kind of go with that, or you can kind of like use whatever puzzles are in there. Like, you know, the modules are there for you to use. Like the stuff is there for you to use, so you really like should use it. Like, it's great to use, even if you don't want to use the adventure word from word. Like, the stuff's there. I think a lot of DMs and a lot of like content creators that I watch would always say that they like to just kind of, even if they don't use the module, they would use the map at least, you know, like, so it's there for a reason, so give it a go. Yeah, I agree with you, Dan. Steal, but not from the bank or anything. Just steal from like books or stuff you like. I steal from Zelda, so.
Yeah, literary theft is a very different thing.
Yes. Excellent. Well, that has been an episode of Cunning Action, where we talk about dungeon design. Maybe some other day we'll do another one. Who knows? Possibly. We can give you more tips. If you have more like questions for us, or if you want us to talk about different parts of dungeon design, you can always leave us a message on at Creature Club Pod on Twitter, or creatureclubpodcast@gmail.com, or if you go to creatureclubpodcast.com and go to the contact us section, you can always contact us there and send us stuff and say, hey, you missed the part where you're supposed to talk about what kind of like flowers are inside dungeons, and you have to give me a list of all the herbs and flowers in dungeons. And then usually we would say no, go away, but you know, if enough people ask us, then sure, we'll do an episode on that. But yeah, go on there, and if you like this episode and more episodes of us, and you haven't already, consider following us on whatever podcast listening platform you use. And if you like us already and you haven't already, maybe consider telling a friend about us, and you know, recommending us this show, because that is always the best way for us to grow. But we always say it's weird to recommend a podcast to a friend. It's kind of a strange thing, but and recommend stuff. But you know what? Sometimes it's good when you do that. You can do it if you want. You can recommend us to a friend if you want. You don't have to, but it would benefit us if you did. So,
yeah, we are biased. So
yes, absolutely. But whatever. I'm not your dad, so it's up to you, man. Like,
yeah.
Am I missing anything else, Dan?
No, I think you covered it all. I think you did a great job.
I think I did, yeah. So, yeah. Thank you for listening, guys. We'll talk about something else next time. So, I've been Mikey.
And I've been Dan.
Stay cool.